I ruined my brother's future. Growing up, my older brother Arlo, 19M, and I, 18F, were the closest of siblings. Well, at least that's what it looked like from the outside. We weren't just siblings, we were also competitors, although I'm not sure he ever realized that. Everything in our lives seemed like a contest to me, but Arlo never seemed to care about winning, because he won without even trying. From the time we were kids, Arlo always excelled. He was naturally smart, a math whiz, and could write essays that sounded like they belonged in a college dissertation. He wasn't just good at school, he was also great at sports, music, and making friends. Meanwhile, I struggled. I wasn't failing or anything, but I had to work my ass off to keep up with his effortless brilliance. I would study for hours to get a B+, while Arlo would spend half the time and ace every test. And it wasn't just academic. Our parents, Corinne and Rowan, praised him constantly. They didn't mean to make me feel lesser, but they couldn't help it. It was always Arlo this and Arlo that. Don't get me wrong, I love my brother. He's always been kind to me, always helped me with my schoolwork, and never rubbed his success in my face. But being constantly compared to him, even if indirectly, had slowly eaten away at me. The pressure to live up to the Arlo standard was immense, and over time, it made me resentful. No matter what I did, it never felt like enough. By the time we hit high school, the stakes became real. Arlo was practically a shoo-in for every top college, while I was still figuring out what I wanted to do. When Arlo got accepted to MIT, everyone was over the moon. He'd always talked about going there, and my parents were bursting with pride. For me, I wanted to go to Stanford. It had been my dream for years, but getting in was no guarantee. I knew my grades were good but not exceptional, and I also knew that competing against students like Arlo would make it tough. Around this time, both Arlo and I applied for the Chancellor's scholarship. This scholarship was everything. It wasn't just prestigious, it was also a full ride to whatever school you chose. It could have made the difference between me getting into Stanford or not. For Arlo, he needed it to help cover his tuition at MIT. Our parents couldn't afford to send us both to these expensive schools without serious financial aid, so we were both gunning for it. The scholarship exam was brutal. It was the kind of test where you had to be not only book smart but also clever and strategic in your answers. I studied harder than I ever had, pulling all-nighters, barely sleeping in the weeks leading up to it. But the truth was, deep down, I knew I didn't stand a chance against Arlo. He was a natural, and I was. Well, me. That's when things took a dark turn. One night, just a week before the exam, I stumbled across an anonymous message board where people were talking about tips and strategies for the Chancellor's exam. Most of it was harmless, people discussing study guides and offering advice. But one post caught my eye. It was a comment from someone claiming they had access to the actual test questions. I didn't believe it at first, it sounded too good to be true, like one of those scams. But something in me clicked. I felt desperate. The fear of failing, of once again being outshined by Arlo, consumed me. I'd been living in his shadow for so long, and I was tired of it. I needed to prove to myself that I could win. And so, against my better judgment, I followed the lead. The anonymous user sent me a file with what they claimed were the test questions. At first, I told myself I wouldn't look. But curiosity and desperation won out. I opened the file, scanned through the questions, and realized they were legit. Panic mixed with a rush of adrenaline. I spent the next several days memorizing the answers, telling myself that this was my shot. It wasn't just about the scholarship anymore, it was about stepping out of Arlo's shadow for once and taking control of my own future. The day of the exam, I walked in feeling a strange sense of calm. I knew I had the answers, while Arlo seemed his usual, relaxed self. We sat a few rows apart, barely exchanging words, both focused on the task ahead. I remember looking over at him as he effortlessly flew through the questions. Meanwhile, I felt a little too confident as I filled in my answers, knowing exactly what was coming next. By the end of it, I was convinced I had nailed it. I would finally have something to prove that I wasn't just Arlo's little sister. A few weeks later, the results came in. I had won the scholarship. It was surreal. My parents were beyond proud of me, even more so because they hadn't expected it. Arlo had also performed well, but for once, I had beaten him at something. I could see the look of surprise on his face when he found out, but, as always, he was gracious about it. He congratulated me, told me how proud he was, and even joked that maybe I was the smarter sibling after all. It should have been the best moment of my life, but there was this pit in my stomach. I knew I hadn't earned it. For a while, I thought I had gotten away with it. I got the scholarship, Arlo was still on track to attend MIT, and everything seemed fine. But then, a month later, the school announced an investigation into cheating on the Chancellor's exam. Someone had tipped them off that the test had been compromised, and they were looking into several students. My heart sank. I knew I was guilty, and I had no idea what to do. If they found out, I would lose the scholarship, my shot at Stanford would be gone, and my parents would be devastated. I would be the failure I had always feared becoming. I was spiraling, trying to figure out how to cover my tracks, when Arlo came to me one night. He sat me down, his expression serious, and told me that he knew what I had done. My stomach dropped. I thought he was going to confront me, to expose me, but instead, he said something I'll never forget. "I'm going to take the blame," he said quietly. At first, I didn't understand. Why would he take the fall for something I had done? But Arlo explained that he had overheard some of my late-night study sessions, piecing together the truth. He knew how much pressure I had been under, how badly I wanted the scholarship, and he didn't want to see me lose everything. He had already been accepted to MIT, and he said he could handle the fallout better than I could. I tried to argue, to tell him that it wasn't right, but the guilt had rendered me speechless. I couldn't let him do it. But deep down, I was too afraid to confess. I wanted to keep the scholarship, even if it meant Arlo had to take the fall. A few days later, Arlo went to the school and admitted to cheating on the exam. He said he had accessed the questions early to help me win, that he had wanted me to succeed and had made a mistake. The investigation ended with his confession, and he was stripped of his scholarship and MIT admission. My parents were heartbroken, but they believed him. They couldn't understand why he would do something like that, but they assumed it was because he cared too much about me. My mom kept saying, "He's just so selfless, always thinking of others," while my dad tried to comfort him, saying he could reapply next year. As for me, I kept the scholarship. The investigation didn't touch me, and I got away with it. I got everything I wanted, admission to Stanford, the full ride, the future I had dreamed of. But it came at the cost of my brother's future. Arlo never blamed me. Not once. But I could see the change in him after that. He was quieter, more withdrawn. The spark that had always made him so brilliant had dimmed, and I knew I was the reason. Our relationship was never the same. The weight of the guilt was unbearable. Every time I saw him, I was reminded of the sacrifice he had made for me, and I couldn't live with myself. I had destroyed the one person who had always believed in me, and I wasn't sure how to make it right. Now, I'm sitting here, months later, with everything I thought I wanted. But I've never felt more empty. Arlo's life was ruined because of my selfishness, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for that. If you've ever made a selfish choice like this, write "I cheat" in the comments. If you haven't, hit subscribe.